Number 10. Yikes at Yeeps. Canadians, maple syrup, Tim Hortons, and for some reason a lot of famous comedians. I don't know why we have a lot of comedians, but we do. That's right, you know them, you love them. What you may not know is that we, for some reason, possess the ability to be the most effective forces in combat. Who would know? You wouldn't think that for a bunch of nice plaid wearing, hockey watching beer enthusiasts. Our mettle was tested in the First World War, which really showed the world that Canada was here to stay. However, this came at the cost of many young men's lives. The Second Battle of Ypres comes to mind, where the Germans first used chlorine gas as a chemical weapon, which in case you were wondering was a huge no-no. I can only imagine the confusion and horror as yellow-green smoke crept its way across the field, then to cause such horrible effects on the soldiers, who were reduced to urinating in handkerchiefs just to breathe. I talked to the chief last night. He just came in from Moose Jaw, bud. Said that's not it. Number 9. Anglo-Franco blood. The Battle of the Somme was supposed to be a quick battle that would see a joint force of French and English soldiers pushing through the Somme River to break the German line of defense. There's really no such thing as a quick battle though, is there? A lot of the men were fresh and new and were eager to jump in only if they knew what awaited them. This list is going to be full of not so fun battles. The Somme was just that. The British suffered 58,000 casualties, with over a third being deaths. You can imagine how the excitement and eagerness to be in a war quickly left the young men's hearts and began to fill with dread. Trench warfare was not a joke. Mixing the new and deadly weapons that made up the First World War with the old world strategies and tactics, and you've got a recipe for annihilation. No thank you, I will pass. Number 8. Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. You probably know about this one, but man, it's kinda messed up. World War I was messy. It was costly, and it was paid in full by the men and women who lost their lives. America, while getting a very hard rap from the international community for joining the war very late, still put in a large effort into the First World War, and for that, lost many men to the cause. Like in all wars, after years of brutal fighting, the logistics can get a little muddy. Some soldiers' remains were simply just never found or identified. You can find these tombs all over the world, but perhaps it was the First World War that made it well known. And also perhaps the war to have the most unknown soldiers. Wherever you guys are, thank you for your service. Number 7. The American Revolutionary War. No taxation without representation. That's right, it's the war that gave birth to the greatest country on the planet. Go ahead, just ask them. They'll tell you. As far as revolutions go, this one is rather mild, but not without its bloodshed. The American colonists were sick of paying British taxes and having British troops occupy their cities. So after a tea party that was either really fun or not so fun, depending on which side is telling the story, the colonists banded together and formed a militia, eventually turning into the Continental Army, led by George Washington. At first it looked like an easy win for the British Empire, outmanned and outgunned. However, after years of fighting, the British had no choice but to surrender. A collection of colonists managed to defeat the largest empire on earth in war. God bless America. Number 6. Bad diet. Imagine a brand new continent to explore, with things to see and resources to exploit. Sounds like a dream come true. Except, what's that smell? Oh man, it's colony cuisine. Ugh. That's right. Even though the history books would make it seem being a colonist was fine and dandy, it was anything but. Specifically food. Being a colonist was difficult, especially if you were one of the earliest to arrive. Harsh winters made crops hard to grow, recipes were basic, and food was meant for survival, not indulgence. Things like corn, wild game, pretty much whatever you get your hands on. Oh, and don't forget, things had to be packed with salt in order to preserve them. Flavor, just like the Roanoke Colony, was nowhere to be found. I'm getting thirsty just thinking about all that salt. Number 5. Military strategy. If you've seen a movie that takes place in the colonial era, you might see lines of redcoat soldiers with their muskets unleashing volley of lead and smoke on the enemy, who is also lining up to do the same thing. Why would you line up to get shot at? It seems impractical, but with the technology of the time, lining up to open fire makes a lot of sense. When in a line formation, it's easier to deal with cavalry charges. Staying strong in a line with bayonets drawn makes it difficult to be flanked, but perhaps the most effective reason was the colonial muskets were extremely inaccurate. Smoothbore muskets were infamous for having bad accuracy, creating a lot of black smoke, and just being tedious in general. Even the best soldiers require minutes to reload. So in order to fix this, just add more soldiers to hit your target. I'm still waiting for the 360 no-scope montage 1776 edition, guys. Number 4. Salem witch trials. You know them, you love them, gotta burn them. Witches. So the colonists thought. Back in the 1690s, people weren't as enlightened as us today. Once the townsfolk got a hold of some hearsay, it could very easily stir controversy and hysteria. The best example of this is the Salem witch trials. Whenever a young woman had done something deemed unsavory, she was declared a witch by an official. This got worse as times went on. Neighbors turned on each other and accusations quickly turned into the worst barbecue ever. Many young women were burned at the stake for reasons that more often than not were minor or no reason at all, with townsfolk coming up with a variety of different ways to diagnose bewitching and witchcraft. With a lack of scientific evidence for the accusations, even flat earthers are saying no. Number 3. The Ottoman War. Not something that's often talked about is the other fronts of the war. Yes, it would be impossible to talk about World War I without talking about the trenches in Europe. But this was a world war and spanned many different countries and biomes. Something that I think gets looked over a lot is the British involvement with the Ottomans in the deserts of the Middle East. Also the Anzac forces at Gallipoli. Shout out to my friends down under, how are yous? But this is just a theater of war that doesn't get a lot of attention, even though it should be considering the Ottomans lost their empire after the war was over. The war changed lines on maps everywhere, all over the globe, and set the stage for not only World War II, but politics for the rest of the 20th century. Number 2. Mistakes were made. Okay, this wasn't exactly something that happened on the battlefields of the First World War, but it happened in 1917, and it was directly related to the war, the Halifax explosion. If you know, you know. When the French cargo ship, the SS Mont Blanc, collided with another ship in the Halifax harbor, a fire had started. The ship's cargo, unfortunately, was high explosives. A lot of them. The fire eventually detonated the explosives, and the chaos that followed was astronomical. It destroyed that district of the city, with almost 2,000 civilians perishing in the explosion. It was the largest man-made explosion until the detonation of the nuclear bombs in World War II. This is why there's 1,000 rules for carrying dangerous or harmful materials. Mind you, I don't think you guys are delivering those kind of contents these days, but if you are, that's kind of cool. Number 1. The League of Losers. Okay, so the war comes to an end, and although the first party contributors to the war have stopped fighting, there's still a lot of turmoil in Europe, especially in the East and the Balkans. When sitting down at the negotiation table, 3 things happened. 1. They said that was bad. Wars cost a lot of lives. Number 2, with the use of modern technology and knowledge from that war, we as the most powerful nation should band together to form a global committee to make sure that doesn't happen again. And number 3, you suck, Germany, this is all your fault, give us your money. Stupid idea. The League of Nations was created as a beta version of the UN, except the rules suck more than they do now. And America, one of the founding members and the ones proposing all this anti-war ideas, did not join. What? Which sure, they were basically forced into the war in the first place, but come on, it soon fell apart. And you know what came next. World War II came next. It was pretty bad. It was a bad sequel.
Number 10. The aviator suit. When it comes to new ideas or new inventions, it almost always starts messy, right? In some way, shape, or form. In today's list, it gets a little messy. A lot of horrible experiments done with groups of unaware subjects. To kick this grim one off, we'll look back to the early 1900s. We'll start with Franz Rachels, a known inventor of the time. He invented his own version of a wearable aviator suit, basically a parachute, and it was made of 320 square feet of fabric, so not light at all. There's a lot of weight in his backpack. Now, in 1912, Franz wanted to test his new invention out publicly. Instead of using a dummy and throwing that dummy off the Eiffel Tower, he himself leaped. He strapped himself in and he leaped to his own death. Yeah, try not to say too many dark things here, but it was tragic. He publicly failed an experiment, and I think there's one photo of it online. It's like the only photo too of the 1900s, and it happens to be this guy. Number 9. Monkey head transplant. Okay, this one's gonna make your head spin. The first ever successful monkey head transplant was back in the early 1970s. I imagine some of your parents may have heard about this. I bet it would be pretty hard to forget. I don't know, ask them about it. Ask them in the middle of dinner. Be like, hey, what about that monkey head transplant? They'll spit out their spaghetti and be like, how do you know about that? American researcher Robert White pulled off the otherwise impossible in a slow, tedious, horrible operation. White took the head of one monkey and then attached it to a headless monkey. Now add a little time and energy and patience, voila, this actually worked out. Yeah, the monkey actually tried to bite one of the surgeons once it came back to life, which, I mean, totally fair. I'd be a little pissed off too. I'd try and bite someone if they put my head over there. Sadly, the monkey passed away 9 days later, but like the fact that this actually happened, 1, is terrifying. 2, dare I say it's a little miraculous. It's obviously scientifically insane. And 3, it's quite unfair to the animal in question, so let's never do this one again, shall we? Number 8, the Kola Super Deep Borehole. Alright, let's put all our resources together and dig a deep hole. If you dug a hole through the center of the earth and then you jumped in, would you come out on the other side? Of course not, this isn't a cartoon, you would melt, you wouldn't get anywhere close. But it is the Arctic Circle in the 1970s, and Russia had a budget for such a thing, so a test was underway. Scientists began working on the project in 1970, and they got to about 40,000 feet come 1989. So for that many years, Russian dudes in winter coats were all just waiting, watching a hole be drilled. I love this image in my head, that's awesome. They got 1/3 through the Baltic continental crust. They got really deep and they found rocks older than 2 billion years old, which is great, but eventually they hit this muddy lava, what do you know, and they had to pack it up. A huge concern here was that demons would be released from the earth. That's fair, that's more than fair. That's a thought that I would probably have if I was deep down there, okay, for sure. The previous title for deepest hole belonged to the United States Bertha Rogers hole, which reached 31,000 feet. Stanley Yelnats would be so proud, honestly. He'd be watching like, oh yes, you guys are killing.
Number 7, poor Germany. The number 2 bad guy in movies besides spooky scary Russians is Germans, and let's be honest, we had to fight them off twice. It left a bad taste in the international community's mouth. When we talk about World War II, we can say that Germans were 100% the villains of that story. That's just how it goes, along with its imperial and fascist sidekicks, Italy and Japan. However, for the First World War, it's not so simple. While Germany was one of the main contributors of the destruction in the war, I don't think it's fair to completely blame them for the war. However, history is written by the victors, and Germany didn't win that one. And that's what's kind of messed up, is the Treaty of Versailles, which made Germany pay back an absurd amount of money in reparations, almost an imaginary number, especially right after a war. It also saw them demilitarize the Rhineland and give some crucial land and strategic resources like the industrial goods and power of the Ruhr Valley. Germany got wrecked in a nutshell. This made Germany go through hard times, harder than most other countries at the time, and was a main contributor in the rise of fascism and history's favorite mustache man. Number 6, failed art student. Speaking of a super evil dictator mustache man, he was a soldier in World War I. After spending his years as a mediocre artist at best, painting paintings and postcards for whatever little money he could. People say his artwork is good, but I think it sucks and his proportions are off. Nerd. Anyway, when the Great War broke out, he and many other young men felt inspired. The patriotism was alive and well. He regarded this time in his life in the trenches with his comrades to be some of the best. However, there was an incident where Mustache Man was in the sights of a British soldier, who with a swift pull of a trigger could have put Mustache Man down for good. However, he showed mercy and let him live, which later was probably a really awkward moment considering the events of World War II. This event is somewhat debated, and honestly, regardless of if he made it out to World War II or not, it was probably still going to happen. So, kind of a missed chance, I guess. Number 5, oh Canada. The most defining moment for Canadians of the war was Vimy Ridge, a very costly battle that not only cost many Canadians their lives, but also many other armies trying to take it. Some people like to point out that America became a country during its war for independence. Well, Canada found its national identity in the battlefields of France. All Canadian regiments were put together for the assault, men from all across the country together in a moment of glorious pride. One general is quoted as saying, "In those few moments I saw the birth of a nation." As glorious as it was, this was World War I, which means the fighting was brutal, fighting that I know I could not do. So, thank you gentlemen. There at Vimy Ridge stands a large monument to the grim day that Canada's identity was born. Number 4, last minute valor. The war to end all wars was to end on the 11th month of the 11th day of the 11th hour, as an armistice had been signed, ending the horrible conflict that had cost millions of lives and had enough destruction to resemble the apocalypse. However, until 11 AM, things were still on, and some violence was still commenced. Probably the most ironic moment in human history was the death of Henry Gunther. Gunther hadn't had the prestigious military career he was looking for. Just minutes before the treaty would have gone into effect everywhere, Gunther spotted a German roadblock position with a machine gun, and looking for a last second of glory, rushed the position with his bayonet against the wishes of his comrades. And the Germans, who were waving with arms, pleading with him to stop. As he got closer and closer, the Germans had no choice but to cut him down with machine gun fire. The time was 10:59, 1 minute 60 seconds before it was all over, and he lost it all just for an ounce of glory. War is hell, man.
Number 3, Stanford Prison Experiment. Perhaps the most famous psychological experiment gone wrong. The Stanford prison experiment started on August 14, 1971, and was led by university psychology professor Philip Zimbardo. Now, the experiment took volunteers and divided them into two groups. One group of prisoners and then the other group of guards. Then they placed all the volunteers into this fake prison that was created for the experiment, and the experiment aimed to see if and how quickly humans would just turn evil under the right conditions with the right amount of power. Pretty twisted, but yeah, I'd say we deserve to know what happens. It's a group version of the Milgram experiment, so it's an awful experiment on paper, but it's something you think about for 40 years afterwards. It was a test to try and answer the question of if humans are inherently good or inherently evil. And after just 6 days, the experiment needed to be wrapped up because the guards began tormenting the prisoners. Yeah, humans are awful, it seems. It really showed the kinds of things humans can be capable of even after such a short time with such a short, small change of power. You know what I mean? Like, this was less than a week, and these people are already turning into wild, horrible dictators in a fake prison. Number 2, the Great Stink of 1858. It's one thing living through a pandemic, but at least we're not living through something called the Great Stink. This was an event in central London, and it lasted for a few months. In the summertime too, which is just great for great stinks. It was so hot and dry that the Thames River dried up, leaving just sewage left over. In order to continue to work, Parliament had to soak the curtains on the riverside in lime chloride just so that they wouldn't be sick doing their jobs. They almost moved their office to Oxford. That's how bad it smelled. Members of the committee were quitting their jobs. This is hilarious. I mean, it sounds horrible and stuff, but you have to laugh. Imagine formally quitting because it smells that bad. Hundreds of tons of lime were actually being discharged into sewers to hold the smell. So if you had a stuffy nose in July 1858, you could have made 1,500 pounds a week just by putting lemons and limes and stuff into sewers. Nobody wanted to do this job at all. So if you didn't mind the stinky stuff and you loved lime, buddy, I have the job for you. And finally, number 1, the battle of the stray dog. I grew up with dogs my whole life. It's stressful at times. You know, you open the door for a split second and all of a sudden your furry friend with the love of your life is running down the street after a blue jay. It's just like, please don't do that. Please come back. Since the Second Balkan War in the early 1900s, Greece and Bulgaria were going head to head. A lot of conflict, a lot of emotions, tensions are high. Now come October 1925, things escalated to an unbelievable point. A Greek soldier was chasing after his dog, who just decided to bolt randomly, as these dogs do in life. But in doing so, he accidentally crossed the border into Bulgaria. The Greeks at this point were beyond upset, so they marched into Bulgaria, and so began a full-on war, right? Everyone's retaliating to everyone, but really it's just this dog in the middle who accidentally caused such a conflict. By the time the International Committee negotiated a ceasefire to clear up the obvious and horrible misunderstanding, 50 people had already lost their lives. Keep those leashes on, I guess, when you go for your afternoon walkie tonight.
Battle of the Frogs. 1754 was a time of war between vast empires. Many battles took place, but none more unusual than the Battle of the Frogs. That's right. One night in Windham, Connecticut, all was well, until townsfolk began to hear this awful noise. And no, it wasn't Island Boys. At that moment, it was suspected to be an attack from the French. Townsfolk began to amass and gather weapons, as angry mobs are known to do. Alas, there was no attack. When morning came, people began to discover that what they thought was an attack was actually a pond full of frogs, verbally fighting over the last spots of water that had dried up in a recent drought. Hundreds of lifeless bullfrogs lay in the wake of the wicked frog war. So wicked that it had earned 3 ballads written about the event. Movie rights, anyone? Number 9. The disappearance of Roanoke Colony. Roanoke was founded in 1587 in hopes that it would give England a permanent trading post in the New World. Relationships with the local natives hadn't been going too well and were complicated to say the least. So later in 1587, the colony's leader John White went back to England for supplies. Unfortunately, he was slowed down by the Spanish Armada. And of course it takes months to sail by ship. These aren't exactly speedboats after all. When he returned, he was surprised to find that everyone had disappeared, including his family. And all that was left was a wooden post with an engraving. To this day, we have no idea what happened. My theory is John left and the rest of the colonists were like, oh, finally, this guy's gone. Let's get out of here. Number 8. The French-Indian War. Wouldn't be good history without a war, and as far as wars go, this one was vital as it decided the continent's fate. It also wouldn't be a good war if there wasn't some really messed up stuff. The French and Indian War pitted colonist against colonist, and Indian tribe against Indian tribe. It was war over land and trade disputes that not only had it affecting North America, but other large European empires all over the globe. Winston Churchill went as far to dub the French-Indian War as the true First World War. In the end, it left Great Britain victorious, and they seized a ton of land, forcing French colonists to flee southbound to Louisiana. All this would eventually set the stage for the American Revolutionary War.
Yes. Number 7. Talos.
Basically, I'm here to announce that we're building Iron Man.
Tactical Assault Light Operator Suit, aka Talos for short, was a project announced back in 2014. And like the former President Barack Obama said, this was supposed to be a modern day Iron Man suit of armor. It was supposed to change warfare entirely, but 5 years later the project was completely scrapped. Well, obviously it's hard to do. I mean, we could barely launch Google Maps that same year, let alone a suit of armor, so okay, fair, it's tricky. Also, Steve Jobs is dead, so no one can figure this one out. Ideally, the suit would have given the user advanced tactical awareness and advanced military-grade armor, which has an exoskeleton underneath that's obviously wired to the helmet and then wired to the rest of the suit. It's cool. They figured a few things out while creating this suit, but overall, the Iron Man armor wasn't close to being like what we see on the big screen. Number 6. The Hoffling Hospital Experiment. This experiment happened all the way back in 1966 in a time where the rules of psychological experiments were a little more loose, you know, a little more, we don't care, try some out. Right? It's horrible. Because of this, the nurses that were all part of this experiment actually had no idea that they were participants of the experiment, which nowadays would be illegal. That's correct. That's illegal. You can't do that. Basically, this experiment took place during the night shift. Now, this night nurse would receive a phone call during the shift, and on the other end would be one Dr. Smith, who's actually the researcher. He's in on the whole thing. He would ask the nurses quickly to check the medicine cabinet to see if they had astrotin, which was actually a drug that was made up for this experiment. It was actually just a placebo, not a real pharmaceutical. Now, the astrotin would clearly state the maximum dosage of 10 milligrams, but this Dr. Smith, in a hurry over the phone, would ask the nurses to administer 20 milligrams. That's a big no-no. You can't do that ever. They were told that the doctor was in a hurry and that he would sign the authorization papers as soon as he came in to see the patient later on that night. Now, if the nurse decided to give the patient the drug, they would be breaking 3 rules. 1, they're not allowed to accept instructions over the phone. 2, the dose was double the maximum limit stated on the box. And 3, the medicine itself was unauthorized. It was made up. It wasn't in the ward stock list, so it shouldn't be used in the hospital, period. Now, out of the 22, again, unknowing nurse patients, 21 of them went to administer this. Yeah, big oof on that one. Big yikes. But to be fair, that's the entire point of this test. So you look back and you're like, oh, that's not fair. We shouldn't have done that. We have to tell them. But you're also like, but it worked. 21 out of 22? I mean, this was 1966. We don't, obviously got a little bit messy, but this really showed the pressures that nurses were put under. Get a phone call from a random guy and go, oh, I hope so. Number 4, backyard dog breeding. Okay, don't try crossbreeding at home. I don't think I have to tell you why you're eating your Mr. Noodles here watching this at 2 a.m. Don't breed animals. Great, hit that thumbs up. Awesome, good plan. Because things go south, right? Obviously. For example, back in 2010, a woman named Julie Leroy, she was working as an animal control officer. She got a call, an owner of a pit bull puppy said she didn't want to keep her. So when Julie arrived and saw the dog, she was then in complete disbelief. This dog was not just a pit bull dog. This dog was a hybrid and it wasn't healthy at all. But again, all the more reason why you should stick around for the thing. The dog had a squished body, it had a huge jaw, and a terrible underbite. Its body was so deformed from birth due to short spine syndrome. That's because they got said dog from a backyard breeder who was just carelessly breeding a bunch of dogs together, not really thinking about the consequences. Now, thankfully, Julie did bring that dog home and gave her a loving home for the rest of her life. Her name's Kuda, and now she's in great hands. She's actually really, really cute. Dogs with short spine syndrome. Obviously, it's wildly uncomfortable, but man, I love dogs. They're all cute.
Number 3, it's all about the beaver. When French colonists arrived in the New World, it was quickly discovered that beaver pelts would make a profitable business. Not knowing it would help shape the economy and politics of the colonies, the beaver furs led the Europeans to exploring westward, discovering new lands, and for once, peacefully engaging with the Indians. The furs were so profitable that they even sparked a small war amongst Indian tribes, appropriately named the Beaver Wars. If they controlled the pelt, they could control the very profitable trade with new Europeans. Unfortunately for the mighty beaver, after more than 100 years of beaver hunting, it had a severe effect on the beaver population. It's comforting to know that even our founding fathers were destroying the environment for major profit. Number 2. The War of 1812. The United States and Canada share the longest land border on Earth, and that's strengthened by a strong relationship. However, that was not always the case. Back in 1812, the young nation that was the United States felt that the Canadian colonies to the north were not American enough, and probably just needed some America. The British, still feeling upset that their tea was dumped in the Boston Harbor, decided that the White House needed to be repainted, and aided the Americans by burning it down. Another war in colonial North America, but this one rather pointless, as when the war was over, border lines barely changed, and all that fighting was kinda nonsensical. Number 1. Colonizing the continent. The most messed up thing about the North American colonies was the fact that they were colonies. European settlers came from all over Europe to exploit North America and its peoples for monetary gain. Although there were some settlers who treated Indian tribes well, a large percentage didn't. Eventually, when permanent governments were established, the Indians were constantly mistreated, manipulated, and destroyed.